And when I was working at this company, I just had a lot of issues, cultural issues with like racism, with homophobia, with transphobia in the space. I think what I heard when you said that is almost like being so far removed from self-empathy that it
Mm.
becomes so difficult, next to impossible, to empathize with other people.
Welcome to Come Back with Erica Cobb, a community of folks like yourselves who are getting ready and staying ready for their next chapter. My guests today, they are the expert we turn to when discussing the thorniest and most complex problems surrounding social and racial justice. They are an anti-oppression consultant, researcher, the founder and CEO of MMG, and the creator of #BoundaryWork. McKensie Mack, welcome to Come Back with Erica Cobb.
Thank you so much for having me, Erica.
I appreciate it, especially knowing that you are a fellow Chicagoan.
Yeah, we love our city.
Yes, we do. I so appreciate your time. So let's talk about your story and what led to you being on the front line of workers, LGBTQIA plus, and racial justice. So as I mentioned, you are from Chicago. You grew up in a Black family of factory and frontline workers who stayed in their jobs. So tell me about the mindset of your family when it came to work and career.
I mean, I think that I'm guessing probably a lot of what I'll share will not only be familiar to you, Erica, but will be familiar to a lot of your listeners.
Mm.
That one of the first jobs that I had out of college was at an ed tech company. And when I was working at this company, I just had a lot of issues, cultural issues with like racism, with homophobia, with transphobia in the space. And I found myself constantly advocating not only for myself, but for folks that who directly reported to me. So when I decided that I was like really ready to leave that role because I was just so tapped out and was like no longer had the capacity to stay in the space, I remember my family saying, but this job pays well and you have benefits and like, we don't leave jobs. We just like when you find a really good job that pays you well and has benefits and a job that really permits you to be able to take care of your family, you stay in it. And I think that coming from a background like that, interestingly enough, is what really fuels my advocacy.
Mm.
Because I think about Black families going to work in spaces that are incredibly toxic, especially for our parents and our grandparents,
Oh, yeah.
and not really having as many options as we have, and doing it not because they just love the space, but doing it because they really, care so much for their families and for their families' futures.
Yes, I do understand exactly what you're saying. I can completely relate to your story. I'm also really tapping into the part where you said not only advocating for yourself, but also people who relate to you. And I always find this part of our work, whether we consider it our work as an individual or not, it becomes very much tasked with a lot of us who are in quote marginalized demographics to speak up and advocate for ourselves and those around us, although we're under resourced and not supported. So how do you feel that people um should be thinking about that to kind of change their mindset on how they approach those situations?
What I think about often, and I love that question too. What I think about often is that there's an organization called the Interfaith Council on Peace and Justice, and they have the 7 principles of organizing. And the first principle is that activism is always, or organizing, let me correct myself, is always better than activism.
Mm.
Because to be an activist, really, if you want to take that on as an individual person, you can, and you're not really accountable to anybody. You don't have to be unless you really choose to be. But to actually organize and mobilize with people, that changes the game. Because then it becomes not just about issues that are important to you, about your own personal lived experiences. It's where are our experiences, where are the sort of connecting points and the connecting factors that make us want to be able to advocate not only for ourselves, but for one another together.
Mm. Yeah, I'm thinking about just the summer of 2020, being a professional myself in an organization and talking about the strength in numbers and really the idea of working smarter, not harder. But that was a mindset shift for me as well, and as well as a number of my colleagues. And I think about when you were talking about your family and how they approached their different situations in terms of going to work every day, making money. Most of our families were not in conditions that were even safe working conditions. Outside of how they were being treated, it physically wasn't safe. So what was the family or your struggles for your family like in terms of their relationships with their jobs?
Well, when I was growing up, my mom was a single mom of 4 kids, and she worked as a nurse. And at that time when we were coming up, to experience being in a hospital as a Black nurse, and experiencing, considerable racism on a day-to-day basis. I can remember growing up, my mom just being so tired. And I think it wasn't just the 12-hour shifts. I don't think it was just that my mom also was going to school full time, and was working 2 jobs. But I think in addition to that, there was something about her tired that was like spiritually tired, like emotionally, mentally tired.
Right.
And for me, growing up and seeing that, that had an incredible impression on me. First of all, I thought, this is ridiculous. My mom works this much and still sometimes can't afford to feed us, and feels so guilty about that, as if that is her failure, when really that's a systemic failure, right? That's the failure of systems, of governments, but that's not actually the failure of a Black mother who's doing all that she can. And so I think growing up in an environment like that, it did, build up a lot of rage in me, because I'm like, this is so unfair and it's so unjust. And I've been taught that all you do is you work hard, you get your education, you work hard, and then basically kind of clap your hands and you're in your career field that you want to be in, and you can afford to take care of yourself, and that's it. That's the American dream. But I think as you get older, especially when you become, or when you seek out a sort of political consciousness and understanding of how systems work, you begin to learn that it actually is not that easy, especially for people in our communities.
You were talking about going to school and, the idea of, clapping your hands and then all of a sudden you're in this great career.
Yeah.
And truthfully, just behind the scenes, we were talking about, where we went to school. And I know you went to the University of Chicago, which is a very prestigious institution. So a lot of your classmates likely did have that experience of going to school,
Absolutely.
clapping their hands and being able to be in, this career path that they didn't have to face the system failures that you were talking about. So what was something, especially coming out of such a prestigious institution, being so highly educated and prepared for, a professional world? What was one of the first bells that went off that alarmed you about the industry or even the institution that you went to work for?
Really great question. I think that one thing, for me going to U Chicago is I actually graduated with 2 degrees, with 2 bachelor degrees at once, because there was some sort of a programmatic opportunity, that I had heard my white sort of fellow colleagues or classmates talking about, and that's how I found out about it. And I thought, oh, I want to take advantage of that, and I want to graduate with 2 degrees. If I have to do this extra thing or take this extra course or do whatever, then that's what I want to do. And coming out of U Chicago, I think one of the first things that really was really impressed upon me was that, again, this continuing kind of pattern of like fatigue. Because I looked at my white classmates and they were like, I'm ready to go. This is a great experience for me. This is wonderful. I'm heading into this career that I have been looking for, or potentially somebody came to me and offered me a job. Versus what it was like for me graduating was like, I could tell that I definitely was a lot more tired, because it wasn't just going to get an education. It's like dealing with the racism every day and the anti-Blackness from professors, and then also from your classmates, and then from university administrators. So it's, you don't just get a degree. And I think for me, and coming out of that kind of a space, that also was one of those moments where I had to tell myself, like, okay, I know that coming into my own career, I'm going to have to create something for myself, but I'm definitely not going to be looking to create. I'm definitely not going to be looking to follow the same path as my classmates are. And not just because I can't, but because that's not something that I want for myself, because I know there's better for me.
No, it's this. I don't want to be cliche, but like when you know better, you do better. Maya
Yeah.
Angelou, everyone, always recites that. And we don't talk about the application of that quote. We talk about it more in theory. And so the way that you're talking about in terms of applying it, what was that whole process like? Was it a one big thing that kind of made you say, okay, that's it, I'm moving on? Or was it a small thing that really was the catalyst for your personal change?
I think it was a series of things. I love that you mentioned that Maya Angelou quote. I think that what goes along with that is sometimes you look around and you realize these people that I'm with are not my people,
Mm,
or these folks that I'm around, um, you know, they're not folks that I need to have in my community. So the way that I would give an example of that is when I first started in tech, which is like one of my first jobs out of U Chicago. I had an experience where I experienced a very glaring and explicit macroaggression from somebody that I was reporting to directly.
mhm,
And I was on a leadership team. I was the only Black person, the only person of color, and at the time on that leadership team. And I remember the folks in the room saw it, and I could see that they were really shocked by it and were like, "This is actually not acceptable." And then afterwards, I went to them each one on one, like, I would love to hear what you thought about that because nobody spoke up, and I want to get a better understanding of like how'd you experience that. And everybody said privately that was really unacceptable, but would never say that publicly. I would never say that like in a sort of space together with one another to say like, yeah, actually that was wrong, but would say it to me privately. And that for me was a moment where I really had to tell myself like, okay, the problem here is not me. The problem here is systemic. And this is not because I keep having the same experiences with different people in different institutions. And so what I'm experiencing is really systemic anti-Blackness, right? It's like systemic racism. And I think that was one of those first moments was to not blame myself for it,
mm.
or to not say I'm not working hard enough, or because I'm not, focused enough on my entrepreneurism. That's why I'm focusing on all these other things that are happening to me because I'm not focused enough on that, or because I'm not working enough hours. That's why I'm thinking too much about these interpersonal rifts or about the ways in which I'm being mistreated. And
Mm.
so I think that's what happens often is we'll go into what these systems are really designed for us to do, where it becomes sort of like a gaslighting or revising of history in a way where we are always to blame for how other people are treating us poorly or for how other people are mishandling us, when oftentimes, especially in those kinds of environments, it's definitely not the individual.
McKenzie, I'm just going to pause for a second because anytime, I mean, you've had so many nuggets of wisdom and things that I want my comeback to community to take away. But the idea of internalizing and blaming yourself for what you said, other people mishandling you,
Mhm.
is a concept that it takes so long for so many of us to get. And I love the example that you gave about there being a micro or macro aggression in your company that other people identified as such, but they didn't publicly speak out about it. And I just want to remind people, because I've experienced that myself, where I'll get, something will happen and I'll receive a text message from someone who witnessed it. And I'm like, well, why didn't you say something when you, especially
Right.
when I was vocal about it? Now I look crazy in front of everybody else because no one else seems to understand that this was wrong. But clearly, other people did understand that this was wrong because now I'm receiving these like very coy text messages like, sorry that that happened to you. And so when you're talking about internalizing these things, these are really great examples of things to look for to at least remind yourself that it isn't you. And that means that it may not be your work in that moment or something that you should internalize and feel poorly about because it's not you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you emphasize that because it's so true.
It absolutely is true. You just reminded me, so thank you so much. You're listening to Come Back with Erica Cobb. I am speaking with the founder and CEO of MMG and the creator of hashtag Boundary Work, McKenzie Mack. So let's talk about this hot button issue because obviously we know that 40 million Americans picked up and quit their jobs last year. And we call it now this cute version, the great resignation. So why do you, in your experience, believe that people are leaving their jobs?
I think that as somebody who studied anthropology, so the ways, basically it's like the study of how culture evolves over time. Um, something that I think really is important to apply to this, what we're seeing currently that is happening is really it's the evolution of human beings. And I think at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where there were a number of folks that were like, all I really want is a job. Like, so this recurring theme of like, so I can take care of myself and take care of my family. And just as long as I have that, that's enough. And now it's 2022. And folks are saying, hey, having a job is great. And also, I want to be treated well where I work. And I want, for example, a union. I want to be protected. I don't want to just be fired. I don't want to be able to experience discrimination and not really be able to have a community that can support me through that. I want to be able to, for example, be able to have a baby and be able to go out on paid leave. I'm working for $1 billion corporation. Especially, I want to be able to be supported through that and still be able to come back to a job, just to name a few examples. Right. And I think what's happening is, especially with like millennials, with Gen Zers, I think I would even include Gen Xers in this, Gen Xers as well, and then some baby boomers, that there are a number of folks that are like, I've done potentially either I have led my working life in this way for a very long time, or I've seen my parents, my grandparents, my siblings lead their working lives in this way. And I'm tired either of being tired, or I'm tired of kind of seeing my people or people in my community kind of be constantly downtrodden because of where they work, which makes no sense because work really should be a supplement to life as opposed to life being something that we do at the end of our list. And then the first 20 things that we're doing are all work related. So I think really what's happening is that people are changing, and I think changing for the better.
Speaking of change, I'm going to ask this question, and there may not be a true answer to it, but I'm going to throw it out to you because I feel like a lot of the obstacles that our ancestors, our parents faced in generations before us, some of those they did what they had to do so we didn't have to experience those. So when we think of oppression in 1970s in the workplace versus 2022, do you see them under different lenses, or is there a way that oppression has evolved in a way so that we don't see it as that?
I think that it's become more, I think that it's always been insidious. I think it's always been nuanced. I think definitely there was a time previously where it was more commonplace, for example, for a person to be using the N-word in the workplace, for people to think, oh yeah, that's actually acceptable. But then when you fast forward to 2022 and you see all these think pieces and op-eds from folks who've experienced it, who are working at places like Tesla and being called the N-word at work. And so I think that it's one of those things where when you think about the comparison, I think what really happens is that the clothes change, the culture shifts. But then I think if oppression isn't interrupted, then it sometimes can feel like it's the same thing happening over and over again, which I think is sometimes what we'll hear from my elders is this again. We're going, I was going to protests like 40 years ago, and now we're protesting some of the same things. And then I think depending on the environment and the sector, it may not be that explicit because oftentimes a big mistake that we make is we consider oppression to be only things that are incredibly explicit and violent, especially as it relates to like a physical violence. Right. But then oftentimes we don't consider verbal or emotional violence to be real because it's something that is not happening physically to a person. So I think in particular sectors, what will happen is it won't be as explicit as somebody using a racial slur, but it'll be as explicit as a Black woman being passed over for a promotion 10 times over. Meanwhile, there's a white woman that's hired last week that's already been promoted. And it's been a week of her tenure or a month of her tenure or 6 months. And there's a number of folks of color that have not been promoted, although maybe they've been congratulated several times on the great work that they've done, or they have been sort of verbally, privately told that they're doing great work, but then constantly are passed over because really in a space like that, an organization like that, people don't believe that Black folks, that other folks of color have what it takes to be leaders within this space. So I think it can be incredibly nuanced and insidious. And I really do think it depends on the sector. And I think it depends on the class level too. And so I think oftentimes, depending on our class level in our society, if we have less, the expectation is that we should be able to take on more, and we should be able to take being treated worse than folks who have more. And so in thinking about those industry dynamics, I think it's always important for us to add the nuance and to understand that just because we may not have on a day-to-day basis as explicit experiences with these forms of oppression, doesn't mean it's not happening. And just because we have more nuanced experiences doesn't mean that necessarily we have it better. It means that it's all harm, and it are things that need to be addressed and intervened in.
When I was, well, obviously you brought up a Black woman, for instance, and then it made me think about, aesthetics and also the idea of LGBTQIA plus
Yeah,
in open situation. Because I mean, growing up, I'm 41, so I was very much in a generation that I would listen to the mainstream news and they were touting "Don't ask, don't tell."
yeah.
So how is that? How are we seeing both exploitation in the workplace, or ways that are harm that are, I guess, covert over for the LGBTQIA plus population?
Now, this is a great question, Erica. And I think where I'll start is I'll say that, as a Black, queer, and non-binary person, that in the workplace, ways in which that can manifest is what's interesting is you can have various forms of oppression, but then you can have the very same tactics that are used, even though it's being used against different people based on their identity. So for example, if I'm talking about somebody who has less education than everyone else who works within an office,
Mhm.
and folks potentially talk to that person in such a way where they may be condescending, or they're talking down to that person, or they kind of make that person the butt of their jokes, right? And potentially there are other people in the space who hear that and who think, okay, this actually isn't acceptable. They don't say anything publicly. They may go to that person privately and say, hey, when the person made that joke about, where you come from, or about your education, or about your family, that actually wasn't cool. But then they may not say things publicly to intervene in it. Another example would be with a queer person who's working within an office environment, that the way that homophobia or that transphobia manifests, it's not always in such an explicitly violent way, but there are many other times in which it is. So for example, when I say explicitly violent, I mean people who are not experiencing it wouldn't consider it to be explicitly violent, but the person who is experiencing it would know, hey, yeah, this is actually really harmful.
Right.
So it may actually be manifest as like a form of interest or like a romantic interest. And then, right, a person would think, oh, well, I'm showing interest in a queer person, and like they should be thankful for that I'm showing interest in them. Either I'm their boss or their colleague, right, or somebody potentially who's working as a community partner with this organization or company. And so if I'm hitting on them, it's okay because they're a queer person in the space, or because they're a trans person in the space. And I think often unconsciously, and then often consciously too, people think, who could I hit on in this space, or who could I treat in this space in a sort of negative way and get away with it?
Mm.
And what's the likelihood that people would speak up? And if I think people in the space are not likely to speak up because I'm talking to, Tamika, then that's the person that I'm going to attempt to test to see if I can get away with this kind of behavior.
So we've talked about a couple times, we brought up the idea of people who I do believe firmly believe that they're allies by sending that private message or
Yeah.
pulling someone aside and saying that wasn't okay with them, trying to offer that quiet support. Um, so if someone's considering themselves an ally by quietly supporting, what would you like to tell them in terms of how they can be better allies in situations like this?
Yeah. So I think that silence often affirms the bad behavior. It doesn't show that it is wrong or that it should be intervened in. And there are a number of ways in which you can set a boundary in a personal space that don't require, because I think sometimes people who would consider themselves to be allies might say as an excuse or a justification, well, I don't want to escalate it, or I don't want to make it worse. Right. But there are a number of things in which we can display a boundary through our body language, or even through just saying a word or two that displays that, hey, I'm actually not okay with this. So, for example, not laughing when somebody potentially is making a joke at the expense of a person's gender identity or race, right, or class level or immigration status. It could also be saying, hey, actually, I don't find that funny. It could be asking a question where you say, the way you said, you made this comment and we're all here, but I would love to get a better understanding of like, why would you say something like that? Because I don't know why. And you'll find that when you intervene in ways like that, right, which don't necessarily require you to put a lot of emotional capacity into it or to go into some sort of a long monologue within a space, if that's something that's the way that in which you intervene, because everybody has their own style. And those are also really simple things that you can do that go way longer, that I think are way more supportive than the I'm going to message you after the fact, after it's happened, because by that time you've already shown that you agree with it by
Right.
virtue of you not saying anything. And then I think you have to ask yourself, if I was in that person's position and somebody said something similar like that about me or about my family or about, people that I care about, would I also have the same response where I would just laugh along with that, or where I would just kind of like nod or not say anything? And if the answer is no, then that whole justification of that's just not how I intervene, or I don't want to escalate, really what it means is, in this space, I didn't think it was worth it. And
Mm.
I think you have to ask yourself that if it's not worth it for you to step up for a person or advocate for a person that you say you care about, do you really care about that person? And yeah,
Such a great example of representation mattering, because it goes back to exactly the example that you were giving at the top of this podcast of being in a situation where you need to advocate for yourself, and people who like either are somehow representing you or you're representing them. And so that's always the case, because I'm sure a lot of my listeners, because obviously we have a very strong Black female demographic. And that's always the thing. I never hesitate to represent, to say something or to not say something in order to just let everybody sit in it. Because that can be equally as uncomfortable and make people think or have that conversation in that moment. But there are people who I believe are so far removed, not only in terms of how they identify, but also in terms of how they're emotionally capable of even resonating with those feelings. And so I
absolutely.
do see why a lot of people, choose not to intervene or say anything until they've become so uncomfortable in their own silence that
Yeah.
now they're sending you a text 2 hours later.
Yep. You're right. Exactly. Right. And I love what you said about people being far removed from how they identify and being far removed from, I think what I heard when you said that is almost like being so far removed from self-empathy that
Mm,
it becomes so difficult, next to impossible, to empathize with other people. And I think the question becomes, first, do I believe that I'm worthy of protection? And if I don't believe that, that decreases the likelihood by a lot that I am going to advocate for other people around me, or at least advocate for a way that won't be transactional.
right.
Because when I don't believe that, either I will not say anything or I will say something. And then I'm presenting it as some sort of, now it's some sort of a social contract where that person owes me something, as
Mm,
opposed to, you know what, actually, it would be great if we could like actually just support people in the space,
right.
in a community, a working community, because that is what makes the community better for everybody. But it's not something that then should become some sort of a bargaining tool or bargaining chip.
Okay, that was a whole word. You're listening to Come Back with Erica Cobb. We are speaking with the founder and CEO of MMG, McKenzie Mack. McKenzie, tell us about your mission.
So our mission, basically is to interrupt and to disrupt the white dominant change management industry. So these are systems and institutions that are most detrimentally, negatively impacting Black and Brown folks, LGBTQIA plus folks, people living at and below the poverty line, and other folks that are historically marginalized. So why wouldn't we be at the center of developing solutions to actually interrupt and disrupt these kinds of systems that research has shown, both qualitatively and quantitatively, have the most detrimental impact on our communities?
So, when you say you're addressing these behaviors, what behaviors does MMG address?
So we focus specifically on harm within the workplace, on harm and repair, because we recognize that identifying harm isn't enough. Intervention, right, is necessary and required. And then also people actually being able to develop skills, that enable them to seek repair within working communities, and then also just within their everyday, like their day-to-day communities, is critical to building cultures and communities that are safer for everybody.
So we talked about it more on an individual level, more colleague to colleague earlier. But what can companies really do in order to do a better job with their role with social justice issues today?
Well, I think that one thing that I would name is that, like you mentioned, we talked a lot about individuals, and we even touched a bit on boundaries. So individual boundaries with people. I think that if someone were to ask me, what do you think is one of the biggest gaps that we have in terms of like as a culture when it comes to setting boundaries, I would say institutions.
Mm,
Because within institutions, especially within for-profit spaces and spaces that may be nonprofit, but that have a lot of financial and social capital, that's one of the biggest barriers to actually being able to engage honestly with social and racial justice work because there are no boundaries. Or the
mm,
boundary is just as long as it makes us money, it's okay and acceptable. So I think one of the first things that companies can do is they can actually audit their culture. So they can audit their policies and their practices through a lens of social and racial justice, right? To get a better understanding as to how they're having an impact, not just on folks who work within their organizations, but also on the communities, right? The cities that they work within, the states that they work within, to get a better understanding of impact. And then in addition to that, one of my closest friends used to always say this to me over and over again, not to me, but to like folks that we would work with. And she would say, hire better people. And I think, right, the idea of hiring better people means you have to actually understand who are the folks that we have working with us now.
mm,
And where potentially are the gaps where maybe we're bringing in a lot of folks that can get the job done, but that don't have or are not willing or interested in building any sort of skill set around interpersonal dynamics. So they cause a lot of harm, and then do a lot of damage, and then they leave, they go to the next place. And then we continue to kind of like bring the same kinds of folks in. And maybe at the end of 5 years or 10 years, we ask, why is our culture so messed up? And
mm.
it's like, well, because in part, you're bringing a lot of people into this space that aren't safe to work around. So that makes sense. And then I think in addition to that, thinking about what retention looks like, but without tokenizing folks, especially tokenizing Black and Brown people, right? Queer and trans folks. So it's, if you want to actually be the kind of company that can last the next 10 years, especially in the light of like what we're experiencing currently with the grand resignation, the workplace culture has to change. And the ways that we think about work and our relationship to work has to change and evolve, or otherwise we'll become outdated, which is what happens within any sort of culture. So I think it's one of those things of what are you willing to invest to be able to actually get a better understanding of what your culture does currently, how you like it to develop and become a better culture. And then also, what are you willing to invest to actually say no to more people and to become more selective in the folks that you're actually bringing into a community. Even though work is work and home is home, the way in which I think about sort of like retention efforts and about hiring folks, I often like to ask myself, is this somebody that I would actually like to have in my house? Even
Mm,
if it was like on a visiting basis, we don't have to be friends, but it's just like you can stay for 30 minutes. And
right.
if my answer is absolutely not, then they probably shouldn't be working with me because that's probably somebody I don't feel safe with or safe around for one reason or another. So it's if you could put those folks that are most marginalized within your spaces answering those questions as opposed to being white folks who are, going to say no to a lot of folks based on race, unfortunately, or based on feeling uncomfortable because they didn't grow up with folks that are Black, that are brown, right, that have not had as many access to resources as much as they have, then it's how do you center the folks that are most historically marginalized in a space to be able to actually be involved in more of those hiring decisions?
Mm,
Because we know like different people say similar behaviors around discrimination, different people, similar behaviors around exclusion, or around just creating spaces that tend to head more so in the toxic direction than they do in the reparative and restorative direction.
mm. So how are you seeing companies prosper through the help of MMG?
Great question. So we are very publicly pro-union. And with our help, we've seen with our help and then with our support, of course, recognizing that it's staff members who do the majority of that work, which is really painstaking and who spend hours and hours of their time unpaid to actually build unions and to push for unionizing within spaces. We've seen a number of staff members successfully organize unions that are voluntarily recognized by the companies they work within, which is a huge accomplishment for us. We've also seen a number of Black and Brown folks, and if I could focus here specifically on Black women, so that includes cis women and trans women, see another number of Black women who at the end of us working with a company say, you know, when you all came in here, I gave you the side eye because I was like, I don't know what is happening here. Is this a real investment the company is making or not? Are they really going to listen to you?
Mhm.
And then at the end of it now, I actually feel supported. I feel backed. And I feel like there are policies and practices that have been established that actually make me feel safer and make me feel less accountable to carrying the weight of the culture of this company when I'm the person who potentially is being treated poorly and should not be expected to carry that weight.
Right. Right. Oh man, I know I don't want to keep you for too much longer. I know you're so busy. I just wanted to get a little bit more detail into hashtag boundary work and how the movement came to be.
Absolutely. So boundary work came to be maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. But as you know, Eric, we've been through a pandemic, so time,
Right.
I get time mixed up now, but about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And in part, what happened was I was doing a lot of research on boundaries because I was looking to develop boundaries with my family and within my family dynamics and like with my family as a whole, and more so with my extended family and less immediate. And I couldn't find a lot of resources that felt like they actually spoke to my lived experiences and to my identities and the ways in which I was experiencing needing some help for building that foundation and those structures. And so any information that I did find actually was more focused, was like most often written by white women. And it was also very kind of like victim blaming. So like, you know, just say no, or, you know, if somebody's doing something you don't like, then just tell them you don't like that. And it's like, okay, well, can we talk about how power and how privilege shape the ways in which we think about boundaries?
Mm.
And that's how boundary work came to be. Was I couldn't find something that I needed. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to create this for myself. And so took a lot of the human-centered design work that I had done in college, especially when I was getting my master's degree, a lot of the anthropology work, and put that together and start building out a foundation of resources for folks, you know, like me, who were looking for things that they needed to be able to, you know, engage in self-development, but in a way that was not, speaking very honestly and directly, in a way that wasn't whitewashed, in a way that wasn't kind of like watered down.
Right. Man, I'm like looking at the time, like, we got to let McKensie go. But McKensie, oh my goodness. McKensie Mack, where can folks find and follow you?
So folks can find me all over social media at McKensie Mack. That's McKensiemack. If folks are looking specifically for boundary work, they can find boundary work on Instagram and Twitter at Boundary Work Official. And if for people that might be interested in our work at MMG, they can find MMG on Twitter and Instagram at MMG Earth.
Thank you so much. McKensie Mack, again, Comeback Community is an anti-oppression consultant, researcher, the founder and CEO of MMG, and the creator of hashtag boundary work. For more on McKensie, you can go to my online home, comeback.tv, and that's where you'll find the full podcast. McKensie, thank you so much for your time and your energy and all of your resources.
Thank you so much, Erica. Really appreciated this time with you.
I appreciate you. Thank you.